As the judge raised her gavel to deliver the ruling, a voice rang out from the back of the courtroom. "Do not rule, it's a trap," and everything froze. The courtroom was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional shuffle of papers. The high ceilings and polished wooden benches gave the room an air of solemn authority. At the center of it all sat Judge Margaret Hayes, a woman in her late 50s with sharp features and a reputation for being unyielding. Her black robe seemed to weigh heavily on her shoulders as she flipped through the case file in front of her. At the defendant's table sat Marcus Johnson, a 13-year-old black boy with wide, nervous eyes. His faded hoodie and scuffed sneakers stood out against the formality of the courtroom. He fidgeted in his seat, his small frame dwarfed by the oversized wooden chair. His public defender, Mr. Daniels, a middle-aged man with a tired expression, leaned over to whisper something in his ear, but Marcus barely nodded, his attention fixed on the judge. The charge was minor, trespassing in a restricted area, but the potential consequences were anything but. Marcus had been caught sneaking into an abandoned warehouse in his neighborhood, a place he and his friends often used as a hideout. The prosecution had painted him as a delinquent, a threat to the community, and the judge seemed inclined to agree. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Hayes," the bailiff announced, his voice echoing through the room. Everyone stood, their movements stiff and formal. Judge Hayes took her seat, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice crisp and authoritative. "You are charged with trespassing on private property. How do you plead?" Marcus swallowed hard, his throat dry. He glanced at Mr. Daniels, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Not guilty," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. The judge raised an eyebrow but said nothing, jotting down his plea. "Proceed with opening statements," she instructed, motioning to the prosecutor. The prosecutor, a tall man in a sharp suit, stood and began outlining the case. He spoke of Marcus's pattern of behavior, his disregard for the law, and the need to send a message to other youth in the community. Marcus's stomach churned as he listened, his hands gripping the edge of the table. But as the prosecutor droned on, Marcus's attention shifted. His eyes landed on Judge Hayes, and something about her face caught his attention. There was a flicker of something, recognition, guilt, that made his heart race. He had seen her before, not in person, but in a photo his foster mother had shown him years ago. A photo of a young woman holding a baby that looked just like him. Marcus's breath quickened. He had always known he was adopted, but he had never known the full story. His foster mother had told him his birth mother was someone important, someone who couldn't take care of him at the time. But now, as he stared at Judge Hayes, the pieces began to fall into place. The prosecutor finished his statement, and the judge turned to Marcus. "Do you have anything to say before I deliver my ruling?" she asked, her tone neutral. Marcus hesitated, his mind racing. He knew this was his only chance. He stood up, his legs trembling. I know you," he said, his voice shaky but loud enough to carry across the room. The courtroom fell silent. All eyes turned to Marcus, including Judge Hayes's. She froze, her pen hovering above her notepad. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice low but trembling ever so slightly. Marcus took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "You're my mom," he said, his voice cracking. "You gave me away when I was a baby." Gasps rippled through the room. The prosecutor's mouth hung open, and even Mr. Daniels looked stunned. Judge Hayes's face went pale, her composure slipping for the first time in her career. She stared at Marcus, her mind racing. How could this boy know? How could he possibly know? I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice faltering. But her expression betrayed her. There was something in her eyes, fear, guilt, regret, that told Marcus he was right. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, sensing a story far bigger than they had anticipated. Marcus stood his ground, tears streaming down his face. He had spent his whole life wondering about his birth mother, and now, here she was, sitting in judgment over him. Judge Hayes banged her gavel, her hand trembling. "This court is in recess," she declared, her voice cracking. She stood abruptly and retreated to her chambers, leaving the courtroom in chaos. Marcus slumped back into his chair, his heart heavy. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. His life would never be the same. Judge Margaret Hayes sat in her dimly lit chambers, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. The room was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Her mind raced, replaying the moment Marcus had spoken those words, "You're my mom." She had spent years burying that part of her life, locking it away in a corner of her mind where it couldn't hurt her. But now it had all come rushing back. The memories, the pain, the guilt. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing, but the image of Marcus's tear-streaked face haunted her. A knock on the door startled her. Judge Hayes. It was her clerk, a young woman named Sarah, her voice hesitant. "Do you need anything? The courtroom is... well, it's chaos out there." Margaret shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, Sarah. Just give me a moment." The door closed softly, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts. She stood and walked to a small cabinet in the corner of the room. With trembling hands, she opened the bottom drawer and pulled out an old, faded photograph. It was a picture of a newborn baby, swaddled in a yellow blanket, his tiny face scrunched up in sleep. She traced the edges of the photo with her finger, tears welling in her eyes. Marcus. She had named him Marcus before she gave him up. She had been just 18 then, a scared girl from a small town with dreams of becoming a lawyer. Her parents had insisted that giving him up was the only option. "You'll ruin your future," they had said. "He'll have a better life with another family." But now, as she stared at the photo, she wondered if she had made the right choice. Had he been happy? Had he been loved? Or had he spent his life feeling abandoned, just as she had feared? Another knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. This time it was Gloria Adams, the social worker who had facilitated Marcus's adoption all those years ago. Gloria was in her late 50s now, her hair streaked with gray, but her eyes were as kind as Margaret remembered. "May I come in?" Gloria asked softly. Margaret nodded, quickly wiping her tears and shoving the photo back into the drawer. "Gloria," she said, her voice strained. "What are you doing here?" Gloria stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "I heard what happened in the courtroom," she said. "I came as soon as I could." Margaret sank into her chair, her shoulders slumping. "I don't know what to do, Gloria. I never thought I'd see him again." Gloria sat across from her, her expression gentle but firm. "Margaret, you need to talk to him. He's been through so much. He deserves to know the truth." "The truth?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "The truth is that I gave him up. I abandoned him. What kind of truth is that?" Gloria leaned forward, her voice steady. "The truth is that you were young and scared. You made the best decision you could at the time. But now you have a chance to make things right. He needs you, Margaret. Whether you're ready to admit it or not, you need him too." Margaret looked away, her chest tightening. She had spent her entire career upholding the law, believing in justice and fairness. But now, faced with the consequences of her own choices, she felt like a fraud. How could she judge others when she couldn't even face her own past? "I don't know if I can," she whispered. "I don't know how to face him." Gloria reached across the desk and placed a hand on Margaret's. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. Just start by being honest with him. He doesn't need a perfect mother. He just needs to know that you care." Margaret took a deep breath, her mind racing. She knew Gloria was right, but the thought of facing Marcus, of admitting her failures, terrified her. Still, she couldn't ignore the look in his eyes, the raw pain and desperation that had cut through her defenses. "Okay," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I'll talk to him." Marcus sat in a small, sterile conference room, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The room was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the courthouse outside. He felt numb, his mind still reeling from what had just happened. He had spent his whole life wondering about his birth mother, and now here she was, a judge of all people. The door opened, and Judge Hayes stepped inside. She looked different now, her usual air of authority replaced by a quiet vulnerability. She sat across from him, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them on the table. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken questions and years of pain. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "Why did you give me away?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret flinched, her heart breaking at the raw hurt in his voice. "I was young," she began, her voice shaking. "I was just 18. I didn't know how to take care of you. My parents, they told me it was the best thing for you." Marcus's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't look away. "Did you ever think about me? Did you ever try to find me?" Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "Every day," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought about you every day. But I was scared, Marcus. Scared that I wouldn't be enough for you. Scared that I'd only make things worse." Marcus's hands clenched into fists on the table. "You don't know what it's like," he said, his voice rising. "You don't know what it's like to grow up wondering why your mom didn't want you. Why she didn't even try to find you." Margaret's tears spilled over, her composure crumbling. "You're right," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "I don't know what that's like, and I can't change the past. But if you'll let me, I want to be here for you now. I want to make things right." Marcus stared at her, his expression a mix of anger and sadness. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said quietly. "I don't expect you to," Margaret replied. "But I'm here, Marcus. And I'm not going anywhere." For the first time, a flicker of understanding passed between them. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. The conference room felt smaller than ever, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Marcus and Margaret sat across from each other, the weight of their shared history pressing down on them. The silence was heavy, but for the first time, it wasn't filled with anger or fear, just a quiet, tentative understanding. Margaret broke the silence first. "Marcus," she began, her voice soft but steady, "I know I can't undo the past, but I want to try to make things right. If you'll let me." Marcus looked at her, his eyes searching hers for something. Honesty, maybe, or a sign that she truly meant what she said. "What does that even mean?" he asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. "You're a judge. I'm just some kid from the system. How do we even start?" Margaret took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "We start by being honest with each other," she said. "I don't expect you to trust me right away. I know I have to earn that. But I want to be part of your life, Marcus. If you'll let me." Marcus looked down at his hands, his mind racing. He had spent so long imagining what it would be like to meet his birth mother. But now that she was here, he didn't know how to feel. Part of him wanted to push her away, to protect himself from being hurt again. But another part of him, a smaller, quieter part, wanted to believe her. Wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can trust you." Margaret nodded, her heart aching at his words. "That's okay," she said gently. "You don't have to trust me right now. But I'm here, Marcus, and I'm not going anywhere." Later that afternoon, Marcus stood on the courthouse steps, the cool breeze brushing against his face. The chaos of the courtroom had died down, but his mind was still racing. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Gloria, the social worker who had been there for him since he was a child. "How are you holding up?" Gloria asked, her voice warm and familiar. Marcus shrugged, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I don't know," he admitted. "It's a lot to take in." Gloria nodded, her expression understanding. "It is," she said. "But you're stronger than you think, Marcus. And you're not alone in this." Marcus looked at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "Do you think she's telling the truth? Do you think she really wants to be part of my life?" Gloria smiled softly. "I think she's scared," she said. "But I also think she cares about you. Give her a chance, Marcus. You might be surprised." That evening, Margaret sat in her living room, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. The events of the day played over and over in her mind, each moment more vivid than the last. She had spent years building a life for herself, a life of order and control. But now everything felt uncertain. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she picked it up to see a text from Gloria. "He's willing to meet with you again. Take it slow." Margaret exhaled, a mixture of relief and anxiety washing over her. She knew this wouldn't be easy for either of them, but for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. A few days later, Marcus and Margaret met at a small park near the courthouse. It was a neutral space, somewhere Marcus felt comfortable. They sat on a bench, the silence between them less heavy than before. "How's school?" Margaret asked, breaking the ice. Marcus shrugged. "It's okay," he said. "I like math, but history's boring." Margaret smiled faintly. "I was never good at history either," she admitted. "But math makes sense. It's logical." Marcus glanced at her, a hint of curiosity in his eyes. "Did you always want to be a judge?" Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," she said. "I wanted to make a difference, to help people. But I think I lost sight of that along the way." Marcus didn't respond, but he didn't pull away either. For the first time, they were just two people trying to figure things out. Over the next few weeks, Margaret made an effort to be part of Marcus's life. She showed up at his youth center one afternoon, surprising him during a basketball game. At first, Marcus was embarrassed, but when she cheered for him after he made a shot, he couldn't help but smile. "You're not half bad," Margaret said with a grin as they walked out together. Marcus rolled his eyes, but there was a lightness in his step that hadn't been there before. "You're just saying that because you're my mom," he teased. Margaret's heart swelled at the word. It was the first time he had called her that, and it felt like a small victory. The final scene of the chapter takes place back in the courtroom, but this time, the atmosphere is different. Marcus's case has been dismissed, thanks to Margaret's intervention and the evidence of systemic corruption that had been uncovered. As they stood together in the now empty courtroom, Marcus turned to Margaret. "Thank you," he said quietly, for not giving up on me." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "I'm the one who should be thanking you," she said. "You gave me a second chance, Marcus, and I'm not going to waste it." One Saturday morning, Margaret suggested they meet at the local library. Marcus had mentioned he needed help with a history project, and Margaret, despite her own dislike for the subject, offered to assist. They sat at a small table in the quiet corner of the library, surrounded by stacks of books. "So, what's the project about?" Margaret asked, flipping through one of the books Marcus had gathered. "The civil rights movement," Marcus replied, his voice low to avoid disturbing the other patrons. "I have to write about how it changed America." Margaret nodded, impressed. "That's a big topic. Where do you want to start?" Marcus hesitated, then pointed to a photo in one of the books. It was a black and white image of a young black boy holding a sign that read, "I am a man." "This," he said, "I want to write about the kids, the ones who were my age but had to fight for things I take for granted." Margaret's heart ached at the weight of his words. She looked at him, seeing not just a boy struggling with a school project, but a young man beginning to understand the world in a deeper way. "That's a powerful angle," she said. "Let's see what we can find." They spent the next hour poring over books and articles, discussing the bravery of young activists like the Little Rock Nine and the Children's Crusade. For the first time, Margaret saw a spark of passion in Marcus's eyes, and it filled her with pride. A few days later, Margaret invited Marcus to her home for dinner. She had spent the entire afternoon cooking, something she hadn't done in years. When Marcus arrived, he looked around the spacious, neatly decorated apartment with wide eyes. "This is nice," he said, his tone cautious but genuine. Margaret smiled, trying to hide her nervousness. "Thank you. I don't entertain much, so it's good to have a reason to cook." They sat down to eat, the conversation flowing more easily than before. Marcus told her about his friends at the youth center, his favorite basketball players, and his dream of becoming an engineer one day. Margaret listened intently, savoring every detail. An engineer, huh? She said, impressed. That's a great goal. You'll need to focus on math and science, but I know you're already good at those. Marcus shrugged, but there was a hint of pride in his expression. Yeah, I guess, but it's hard to think about the future when, you know. Margaret's smile faded. When what? She asked gently. Marcus looked down at his plate, his voice softening. When you don't know if anyone's going to be there to help you. Margaret reached across the table, placing her hand over his. I'm here now, Marcus, and I'm not going anywhere. One afternoon, Marcus invited Margaret to watch him play basketball at the youth center. She arrived just as the game was starting, feeling out of place among the cheering parents and energetic kids. But when Marcus spotted her in the stands, he gave her a small wave, and she felt a surge of warmth. The game was intense, with Marcus's team trailing by a few points. In the final minutes, Marcus made a stunning three-pointer, tying the game. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Margaret found herself on her feet, clapping and shouting his name. After the game, Marcus jogged over to her, his face flushed with excitement. Did you see that shot? He asked, grinning. Margaret laughed, her heart swelling with pride. I did. That was amazing, Marcus. You're really good. He shrugged, but his grin didn't fade. Thanks for coming, he said. It means a lot. Despite the progress they were making, there were still moments of tension. One evening, as they sat in Margaret's living room, Marcus brought up the past. Why didn't you ever try to find me? He asked, his voice quiet but firm. Margaret hesitated, her heart aching at the question. I thought about it, she admitted. Every day. But I was scared, Marcus. Scared that I wouldn't be enough for you. Scared that I'd only make things worse. Marcus looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and sadness. You don't know what it's like, he said, to grow up wondering why your mom didn't want you, why she didn't even try to find you. Margaret's tears spilled over, her composure crumbling. You're right, she said, her voice heavy with regret. I don't know what that's like, and I can't change the past. But if you'll let me, I want to be here for you now. I want to make things right. Marcus stared at her, his expression softening ever so slightly. I don't know if I can forgive you, he said quietly. I don't expect you to, Margaret replied. But I'm here, Marcus, and I'm not going anywhere. The chapter ends with Marcus and Margaret attending a community event together. It's a small step, but it's a sign of their growing bond. As they walk through the event, Marcus points out his friends and introduces Margaret to some of the staff at the youth center. This is my mom, he says, his voice steady and proud. Margaret's heart swells at the words, and she gives Marcus a warm smile. For the first time in years, she feels a sense of belonging, not just as a judge or a public figure, but as a mother. One evening, Margaret invited Marcus over to her apartment again. This time, she had something special to show him. She pulled out an old photo album from a drawer and placed it on the coffee table. What's this? Marcus asked, his curiosity piqued. Margaret smiled softly. It's a photo album from when I was younger. I thought, maybe you'd like to see it. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. They sat side by side on the couch as Margaret flipped through the pages. There were pictures of her as a teenager, her parents, and even a few of her holding a baby, him. Marcus's breath caught as he saw the photo of Margaret cradling him as a newborn. Is that me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. Yes, that's you. I kept these photos hidden for years because they were too painful to look at. But now, I want you to have them. Marcus stared at the photo, his heart swelling with a mix of emotions. For the first time, he felt a tangible connection to his past, to the woman who had given him life. Margaret's professional life wasn't without its complications. Her decision to dismiss Marcus's case had raised eyebrows, and some of her colleagues began to question her judgment. One day, she found herself in a tense meeting with the chief judge, who demanded an explanation for her actions. Margaret, you know how this looks? The chief judge said, his tone stern. Dismissing a case involving your own son. It's a conflict of interest. Margaret took a deep breath, her voice steady. I understand your concerns, but I stand by my decision. The system failed Marcus, just as it fails so many other kids. If we don't address these issues, who will? The chief judge sighed, his expression softening. You've always been a woman of integrity, Margaret. But you need to be careful. This could damage your career. Margaret nodded, but she didn't waver. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose that went beyond her career. She was fighting not just for Marcus, but for all the kids like him who had been let down by the system. Marcus's school had been struggling to support him, given his turbulent past. Margaret decided to step in, attending a meeting with his teachers and guidance counselor. Marcus was hesitant at first, worried that her presence would make him stand out even more. I don't need you to fight my battles for me, he said, his tone defensive. Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder. I'm not here to fight your battles, Marcus. I'm here to support you. You deserve every opportunity to succeed, and I want to make sure you have that. At the meeting, Margaret advocated for Marcus, pushing for additional resources and support. She also listened to his teachers, who praised his intelligence and potential but expressed concern about his attendance and focus. Marcus is a bright young man, one of his teachers said, but he needs stability and encouragement. With the right support, I believe he can achieve great things. Margaret nodded, her determination growing. Then let's make sure he gets that support. Despite the progress they were making, there were still moments of tension. One evening, Marcus lashed out at Margaret, his anger and frustration boiling over. You think you can just show up now and fix everything? He shouted. Where were you when I needed you? Where were you when I was bouncing from one foster home to another? Margaret stood there, her heart breaking as she listened to his words. She knew he was right to be angry, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. You're right, she said quietly. I wasn't there when you needed me most, and I can't change that. But I'm here now, Marcus, and I'm not going anywhere. Marcus stared at her, his chest heaving with emotion. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to say more, but instead, he turned and walked away. The next day, Marcus showed up at Margaret's apartment unannounced. She opened the door, surprised to see him standing there. Can I come in? He asked, his voice hesitant. Margaret nodded, stepping aside to let him in. They sat in the living room, the silence heavy between them. Finally, Marcus spoke. I'm sorry, he said, his voice quiet but sincere. I didn't mean to yell at you. It's just hard. Sometimes it feels like no matter what I do, I'm always going to be that kid nobody wanted. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Marcus, you are wanted. You are loved. And I'm so sorry that I made you feel otherwise. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Marcus looked at her, his expression softening. I know, he said, and I'm glad you're here. The chapter ends with Margaret and Marcus attending a community event together. It's a small step, but it's a sign of their growing bond. As they walk through the event, Marcus points out his friends and introduces Margaret to some of the staff at the youth center. This is my mom, he says, his voice steady and proud. Margaret's heart swells at the words, and she gives Marcus a warm smile. For the first time in years, she feels a sense of belonging, not just as a judge or a public figure, but as a mother. Margaret suggested that they attend family therapy together to help them work through their past and build a stronger foundation for their future. Marcus was hesitant at first, but he agreed to give it a try. They sat in the therapist's office, the atmosphere tense but hopeful. The therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Patel, guided them through a series of exercises designed to help them communicate more openly. Marcus, Dr. Patel said, can you tell Margaret how you've been feeling since she came back into your life? Marcus hesitated, then spoke. It's complicated. I'm glad she's here, but sometimes I feel angry. Like, why now? Why not when I really needed her? Margaret listened, her heart aching at his words. I understand why you feel that way, she said, and I'm so sorry for the pain I caused you. I can't change the past, but I want to be here for you now. Dr. Patel nodded, encouraging them to continue. Margaret, how do you feel when Marcus expresses his anger? Margaret took a deep breath. It's hard to hear, but I know it's important. I want Marcus to feel safe expressing his feelings, even if they're difficult. The session was emotional, but it marked a turning point in their relationship. For the first time, they were able to communicate openly and honestly about their feelings. Marcus's history project on the civil rights movement was coming together, and he asked Margaret to help him with the final touches. They spent an entire weekend working on it, discussing the impact of the movement and how it related to their own lives. It's amazing how much those kids accomplished, Marcus said as they put the finishing touches on his presentation. They were my age, but they were fighting for something so much bigger. Margaret nodded, her heart swelling with pride. You're doing something important too, Marcus. By sharing their story, you're keeping their legacy alive. When Marcus presented his project to his class, Margaret was there to watch. He spoke with confidence and passion, earning applause from his classmates and teachers. Afterward, he turned to Margaret with a grin. I couldn't have done it without you, he said. Margaret smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. I'm so proud of you, Marcus. Margaret began volunteering at the youth center where Marcus spent much of his time. She wanted to understand his world better and show her support in a tangible way. At first, the kids were wary of her, but Marcus vouched for her, and soon she became a familiar face. One afternoon, she helped organize a basketball tournament, cheering loudly as Marcus's team won the game. Afterward, one of the other kids approached her. You're Marcus's mom, right? The boy asked. Margaret nodded, her heart swelling with pride. Yes, I am. The boy smiled. He's lucky to have you. Margaret looked over at Marcus, who was laughing with his friends. I'm the lucky one, she said. Margaret's decision to dismiss Marcus's case had not gone unnoticed by Victor Reynolds, the man who had orchestrated the corruption within the system. One evening, he confronted her outside the courthouse. You think you're making a difference? Victor sneered. All you're doing is making enemies, Margaret. You're going to regret this. Margaret stood her ground, her voice steady. I'm not afraid of you, Victor. I'm fighting for what's right, and I won't back down. Victor's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing as he walked away. Margaret knew the battle wasn't over, but she felt a renewed sense of determination. She was fighting not just for Marcus, but for all the kids who had been let down by the system. The chapter ends with Marcus's middle school graduation. Margaret sat in the audience, her heart swelling with pride as he walked across the stage to receive his diploma. After the ceremony, Marcus found her in the crowd. I couldn't have done this without you, he said, his voice filled with gratitude. Margaret pulled him into a hug, tears streaming down her face. I'm so proud of you, Marcus. This is just the beginning. As they walked out of the school together, hand in hand, Margaret felt a sense of hope and possibility. They had come so far, and though there were still challenges ahead, she knew they could face them together. Margaret's fight against the systemic corruption in the justice system came to a head. After months of gathering evidence and rallying support, she presented her case to a higher court. The hearing was tense, with Victor Reynolds and his allies fighting back every step of the way. But Margaret's determination and the truth behind her arguments were undeniable. When the judge finally ruled in her favor, declaring that the corrupt practices would be investigated and reformed, the courtroom erupted in applause. Margaret felt a surge of pride and relief, knowing that her efforts would make a difference for countless kids like Marcus. After the hearing, Marcus was waiting for her outside the courthouse. You did it, he said, his voice filled with admiration. Margaret smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. We did it, she replied. This is for you, Marcus, and for all the kids who deserve a fair chance. To celebrate their victory, Margaret invited Marcus and Gloria over for a family dinner. It was a small gathering, but it felt significant. They sat around the table, sharing stories and laughter, the weight of their past slowly lifting. You know, Gloria said, her voice warm, it's amazing to see how far you've both come. You've turned something painful into something beautiful. Margaret nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. It hasn't been easy, but it's been worth it, every step of the way. Marcus looked at Margaret, his expression softening. I'm glad you're my mom, he said quietly. Margaret reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. I'm glad you're my son. Margaret and Marcus attended a community event together, where Margaret was honored for her work in reforming the justice system. As she stood on stage, accepting the award, she looked out at the crowd and saw Marcus sitting in the front row, his face filled with pride. This award isn't just for me, she said, her voice steady and heartfelt. It's for everyone who believes in justice, in fairness, and in second chances. And it's for my son, Marcus, who taught me what it means to fight for what's right. The crowd erupted in applause, and Marcus stood up, clapping louder than anyone. When Margaret stepped off the stage, he pulled her into a hug. You're amazing, he said, his voice filled with admiration. Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with love. We're amazing, she replied. The final scene of the chapter takes place a few months later. Marcus was thriving in school, his grades and confidence steadily improving. Margaret had taken on a new role as an advocate for juvenile justice reform, using her platform to make a difference on a larger scale. One evening, they sat on the porch of Margaret's house, watching the sunset. The air was warm, and the sky was painted with shades of orange and pink. What do you think the future holds? Marcus asked, his voice thoughtful. Margaret smiled, her heart filled with hope. I think the future is whatever we make of it, she said. And I know that whatever comes our way, we'll face it together. Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Together, he agreed.